everyone. Thanks again so much for joining us. I'm really excited that we're going to discuss one of our top charities, Malaria Consortium's Seasonal Malaria Chemo Prevention, or SMC program. This program stands out on two fronts. First, the SMC intervention itself has been rigorously studied and found to be highly impactful at reducing malaria incidence. Second, Malaria Consortium as an organization has demonstrated its strength in implementing high quality and cost-effective SMC programs. We first recommended them as a top charity in 2016 and continue to believe it offers donors an outstanding opportunity to accomplish a lot of good. In 2019, I was lucky enough to go visit Malaria Consortium's program in Burkina Faso, where I met Christian Rossi, Malaria Consortium's SMC program director, who is here with us today. Christian, thanks so much for joining us. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself and your role at Malaria Consortium?
Yeah, thank you, Olivia, and hello, everyone. So my name is Christian Rossi. I am the Program Director for Malaria Consortium's Seasonal Malaria Chemo Prevention Program. I am based in London, and I oversee our SMC work in Burkina Faso, in Chad, in Nigeria, and Togo, as well as two SMC research projects we currently have in Mozambique and in Uganda. And of course, a very substantial portion of our funding for SMC comes from philanthropic sources, primarily as a result of having been a GiveWell top charity for a number of years now. So I'm really very glad and very grateful that I've been given the opportunity to be here tonight and to have a conversation with you, Olivia, and with the philanthropic community about SMC.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks again for being here. So according to the World Health Organization, $3 billion is invested each year in malaria control and elimination. Over 400,000 people still die of malaria each year. GiveWell itself has given over $420 million to malaria programs over the years, and yet it continues to be one of our most cost-effective and pressing recommendations. What makes malaria such a big problem still?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. That is, of course, the million-dollar question. In fact, if we consider the enormous funding needs that we talk about, it's quite a bit more than a $1 million question. But I think it's important to start with an acknowledgement that a lot of progress has actually been made in the fight against malaria over the last two decades. So the 2020 World Malaria Report, which you mentioned earlier, reports that global malaria mortality has fallen by 60% since the year 2000, and that about 7.6 million lives have been saved in that period. And that was largely thanks to the wide-scale deployment of malaria interventions such as bed nets, indoor spraying, SMC, but also improved access to diagnosis and treatment of malaria. However, it is absolutely true to say that we have seen over the last few years, we've seen a stagnation of progress in terms of achieving the targets that we've set ourselves for the reduction of the malaria burden. And I think there's now very broad consensus that we're not currently on track to meeting those targets. And there are a host of reasons for this. Mm-hmm. So some of those reasons are technical. So malaria is generally a fairly difficult disease to control because the vectors or the mosquitoes, but also the parasites are very adaptable, and they just constantly evolve mechanisms and means of circumventing the tools that we have at our disposal for malaria control. I think it's also fair to say that, unfortunately, we haven't seen the progress that we had hoped to see in terms of innovations, in terms of malaria control. So say new antimalarials or reliable and easy to use diagnostic tools. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes the challenges might be operational, often due to health system constraints, so ineffective implementation of malaria interventions. Mm. And then there are other challenges that frankly go way beyond just malaria or even public health. So I'm thinking of political instability, population growth, migration, climate change, or to name two of the biggest elephants in the room, a global pandemic. And rising insecurity in many of the areas that are affected by malaria.
Yeah.
And then finally, there's the question of sustainable financing for malaria control. So WHO put the gap between the available funding, the amount invested, and the resources needed to meet the targets at $2.6 billion in 2019. So there's definitely a need for continued support. And I say that fully recognizing that that is not just a call to action for the international donor community, but there's also a need to look at sustainable domestic financing mechanisms.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. And you mentioned a few malaria programs, including the two that GiveWell supports, long-lasting insecticide nets and SMC. Most people know about nets and the intervention is fairly straightforward, but I think SMC is a bit less widely known. Can you share what exactly SMC is and how it's delivered?
Yeah, of course. So as you said in your introduction, SMC is short for seasonal malaria chemoprevention. And as the name suggests, it's an intervention that is specifically targeting areas where malaria transmission is seasonal. So that's the case in areas where there is a long dry season with very little or no rainfall for much of the year. And during the dry season, there are very few mosquitoes around because they need sort of humid conditions and stagnant water to reproduce. So for much of the year, malaria cases are fairly low. But then the rainy season starts and the mosquitoes start to multiply. People start to get bitten more often and infected more often. And malaria cases just shoot up and they remain high for the duration of the rainy season and a little while after. And then after the rainy season, they come back sort of right down again and remain low for the rest of the year. And that's really a pattern that we see across much of the Sahel region of West and Central Africa. So that's one important aspect of SMC. It's a seasonal intervention. The other important part, and it's also in the name, is that it's about prevention of malaria. So it is not about treating existing malaria infections, but it's about preventing new malaria infections. And in its most basic form, it involves the community-based, intermittent administration of antimalarials to populations that are at risk during the peak malaria season. And the objective is to retain or maintain levels of the antimalarials in the bloodstream that's high enough to protect from new malaria infections over the period of highest risk, so during the rainy season, really. WHO, the World Health Organization, has been recommending SMC since 2012, and they recommend that it should be targeted at children between 3 and 59 months of age, so that's children under 5. And the reason why we're focusing on young children is really because they're particularly vulnerable to malaria, and they have much higher odds of contracting severe malaria and dying from malaria than older children or adults who have developed a certain level of immunity. We use 2 different antimalarials in SMC. They're called sulfadoxine pyrimethamine, or SP in short, and amidaquine, or AQ. And the current recommendation that WHO have is for annual SMC implementation, annual what we call SMC rounds, comprising 4 monthly SMC administration cycles. It's primarily delivered door to door by community distributors. And each full course of SP and AQ confers a fairly high degree of protection from malaria for about 28 days. And then the protection declines fairly rapidly thereafter, which is why we give the SMC drugs on a monthly basis, and we repeat that over the duration of the rainy season. I would just say, make one more point. So while of course the SMC delivery at the community level, the distribution of the SMC drugs is the core of the intervention, there's actually a lot of other intervention components that need to be in place throughout the year. So starting from planning to supply chain management, procurement, community engagement, to training, supervision, and monitoring and evaluation. So while the delivery is seasonal, the intervention is really is really a year-round activity.
That's so, yeah, that's interesting. It's kind of wild that one pill can or a few pills can just protect a child from malaria for 28 days. So you've mentioned that it's an annual program. What part of the yearly cycle are we in right now?
Yeah, that's a very timely question, because the seasonality patterns are fairly consistent across the Sahel.
Mhm,
So the rainy season starts in June or July, and it lasts roundabout until October. And
mhm.
it just so happens that today was the first day of SMC distribution in 2021, in the 2021 SMC campaign in Burkina Faso. Pure coincidence, but the SMC campaign 2021 started today. And in the other countries we support, Togo will follow next week, Nigeria the week after, and then Chad in early July. Now, I'd love to give you an exact figure for the number of individuals who are involved in the campaign, just to give you a sense of scale. Unfortunately, I don't have the data for 2021 yet, but I can tell you that last year, when we've reached about 12 million children across our program, we had about 150,000 individuals that were involved across those 4 countries. Now this year, we're aiming to reach 17 million children across those countries, and so I would really expect the number of individuals to grow this year.
Oh, that's incredible. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us in what may be crunch time for you with organizing the distribution. So yeah, I was able to go see SMC being delivered in Burkina Faso a few years ago. And the scale that you mentioned is something that really struck me. So being in a health center, seeing dozens of community distributors leaving to deliver this life-saving medication, and knowing that at that same time, there were thousands more leaving other health centers to try and knock on every door in Burkina Faso to see if there were children who needed SMC living there. And from what I saw, it seemed like the community distributors were really a part of the communities that they were distributing in. One community distributor ran into his 6-year-old nephew while we were giving out the medication. We also saw a lot of logistics that were really interesting, like how in rural areas, the distributors would mark on the doors to see if they had already knocked on that door. But in the urban areas where the kids were more likely to be running around with each other and not in the home, they would use Sharpie to mark the nail to see which ones had already gotten the medication. So I'm just curious, how do you adapt the logistics of SMC delivery for different contexts, urban, rural, different countries, things like that?
Yeah, of course. So the basic implementation model is the same in all countries. But one thing that's important to remember is that we implement SMC through countries' existing health systems and under the leadership of national malaria control programs. So once we start looking at the detail of how the intervention is delivered, all of the differences are usually a function of the different health systems in the different countries. And I just give you one example, and it relates to your experience that you just talked about. So who is actually distributing SMC?
Yeah.
So in Burkina Faso, there is a fairly well-developed cadre of community health workers. There are a recognized group of health workers who've been employed by the government. They are trained to provide basic health services. And many of the distributors who distribute SMC are community health workers. So they're recruited from this cadre of health workers. In other countries, that doesn't exist. They are not in the numbers that we would require to distribute SMC. So in Chad, for example, we recruit volunteers from the affected communities and we train them specifically on SMC. And another interesting aspect maybe of adapting, and again, you alluded to that. So there are differences in how you implement SMC in urban areas and in rural areas. So in addition to the example you gave, I would also say that one difference is that in rural areas, people hear about SMC and learn about SMC through community structures, churches, mosques, markets, town announcers, etc. Whereas in urban areas, that doesn't really work. So in urban areas, we need to invest a lot more in sharing health messages through mass media, so TV or social media.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, every year the GiveWell team continues researching each of our recommended charities to make sure that they continue to meet our high standards. So this includes incorporating new research into our cost effectiveness, as well as asking the charities what they would do with additional funds. And so a lot of this for Malaria Consortium is asking questions to you and your team, Christian. What are the best and
Indeed.
worst parts about working with GiveWell from a top charity point of view?
Well, obviously there are no negatives whatsoever. Joking aside, I genuinely I can't overemphasize the role that philanthropic funding for SMC has played in scaling up SMC across the Sahel and maintaining the momentum that was gained through the early implementation projects before the larger, more traditional donors came on board was absolutely fundamental, and it's really allowed us to maintain and even grow that scale of SMC. And even now, when some of the more traditional funders, the Global Fund, the US President's Malaria Initiative, they've bought into the concept of SMC, but even now the need for funding is so substantial that there is a really important role for philanthropic funding. For us, for Malaria Consortium, having that planning security and that operational flexibility that philanthropic funding is giving us makes an immense difference, and it's unbelievably important. I'll just give you one example. So 2 years ago, Burkina Faso had reached almost all the health districts in the country with SMC, but there were 5 districts missing. There's the urban districts in and around Ouagadougou, so the capital city. And we received a request from the Ministry of Health, a very, very last minute request to cover those remaining districts. Now, in a more traditional funding arrangement, it would have been virtually impossible to respond positively to such a request at really short notice. However, because we had the flexibility of the philanthropic funding, we were able to make arrangements very, very quickly. And that meant that we were able to protect an additional 400,000 children that year from malaria, which is obviously fantastic. So I honestly can't overestimate how transformative becoming a GiveWell top charity has been for Malaria Consortium. And we're immensely grateful to all our supporters, but of course, especially to GiveWell. Now, since you asked about the challenges, Olivia, I would say that it took us a while to understand your approach and your thinking. You obviously have a very strong focus on cost effectiveness, whereas public health NGOs like Malaria Consortium, we tend to have more of a focus on, say, health system strengthening. So cost effectiveness isn't necessarily the core of what we think about. So there can at times be almost like a philosophical clash between the way we think. But I would genuinely say that we've established a very constructive working relationship. And while it's true that GiveWell asks many questions, I can genuinely say that those questions are always helpful, and they always prompt us to think about things from a slightly different angle, which I certainly find as experiences as extremely enriching.
Yeah. Well, thanks for those kind words and for implementing such a great program. We're really glad to support it. In general, our understanding is that the scale up of SMC is often celebrated as a malaria success story. And so in recent years, we, as the malaria community, or as a part of the malaria community, have been focusing on if and how SMC can be adapted outside of the Sahel region that you mentioned earlier. Something that we haven't yet written about publicly is that GiveWell has recently supported your trial of SMC in Mozambique. Can you share a little bit more about your findings from that pilot and your plans for the second year of the program in Mozambique?
Yes, absolutely. So just as background, the current WHO policy recommendation for SMC recommends that SMC should be prioritized in the Sahel because the levels of parasite resistance to the drugs we use in SMC, especially the SP, are low across Western Central Africa. However, we've now reached a stage in the Sahel where we're reaching, well, not all eligible children, but most of the eligible children in the Sahel. So WHO is now pushing for SMC to be used more aggressively, including in areas where and geographies where parasite resistance to the SMC drugs is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Now, without going into too much detail, that there are good technical reasons to expect that SMC will have a positive impact in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, parasite resistance is defined as treatment failure. So drugs no longer work for curing existing infections, but SMC is a preventative intervention. And mainly because of the way the SMC drugs interact with the life cycle of the parasite, we think it's highly likely that the drugs will have a protective effect, even in areas where they are no longer effective for treatment. So with that in mind, we formed a partnership with the malaria program in Mozambique, and we are conducting a 2-year research study to test SMC outside of the Sahel. And we've just completed year 1. Which involved delivering SMC to around about 70,000 children in 2 districts in Nampula province, which is in the north of Mozambique, where malaria transmission is seasonal. Now, year 1 was primarily about feasibility and acceptability of SMC in this completely new context, but also collecting some initial impact data, which could inform the design of a more robust impact evaluation in year 2. So we now have some preliminary results from the first phase, which I'll happily share. I just like to stress that A, they're preliminary results, and B, they're not yet meant to provide definitive answers to the overarching research question of, is SMC a viable strategy? But with that in mind, so we found that SMC was feasible and acceptable. We achieved the same kind of coverage rates that we typically see in the Sahel. And we conducted a non-randomized trial where we followed up with a sample of about 700 children in the 2 intervention districts and in a 3rd district, which served as a control. And we found that children who had received SMC had malaria positivity rates that were 80% lower than children who hadn't received SMC. Now, again, this was from a non-randomized trial, so we shouldn't get carried away, but this is really giving us the confidence that we should go ahead with phase 2 of the study, which, as I say, will be a much more robust impact evaluation, including a properly randomized control trial. We're working through the details of the study design at the moment. I can't give you a lot more detail at this point, but we will publish the study design, and we'll also publish all of our results. And maybe one final word on this. We've also built in a component that looks at parasite level resistance at different points in time. Which we really hope will give us important insights into how effective we can expect the intervention to be in the longer term. I'm afraid I don't have any results from this study yet, but it's really exciting work. It could transform the way SMC is being deployed in a completely new geography.
That's incredible. It's great to hear how Malaria Consortium is, continuing to innovate. So yeah, thank you so much for your time and for answering our questions. Questions from the audience are coming in the chat to the panelists. So we'll go over that in the Q&A after we talk a little bit about malnutrition. So as Catherine mentioned earlier, this year, GiveWell's research team is investigating